What's up, guys? It's me, Coach Mills here, and today we're going to be breaking down the DPS tier list for the current patch of Overwatch, breaking down all the best and worst DPS that you could be climbing with, and giving you some targeted tips that you can incorporate in your games. Do me a huge solid and press that subscribe button because we're super close to 50,000 subscribers, and check out my stream right now down below for VOD reviews, gameplay, tips and tricks, and more. Check me out live Monday, Wednesday, Friday at 6 p.m. CST. Now, before we get into this list, I want to make it clear that every single character on this list, you can climb to Grandmaster. However, there are some characters that the climb is going to be easier with, and there's some characters that are going to be more dominant when players are actually playing the meta in Grandmaster Plus. So consider that before you look at the tier list, and just because the character is low, doesn't mean the character is unplayable by any means. Now, first off, let's talk about Ashe. And Ashe is very freaking strong right now. Ashe has the capability to actually really just rack up damage with a pocket. One of the best characters to be pocketing. Very, very difficult to deal with when she is getting pocketed. And even if she's not, she still outputs a ton of damage. Bob is very, very freaking strong right now. Capable of just winning team fights by itself in a 5v5. And all in all, Ashe is going to be put in the A tier. Not the most powerful pocketed character, but one of the best characters generally in the game right now. Long distance hit scans are just being really, really strong in the meta. Now, next up, let's talk about Bastion. And Bastion's a really weird one because I think that depending on the rank you're in, you can get a lot of value out of Bastion, but you got to understand that, especially when we talk about higher ranks and players that actually use the utility to counter him properly or coordinate around his turret form, he's pretty easy to shut down. He can get naded, he can get slept, he can get hooked, he can get just shot because he has a huge hitbox. There's a lot of weaknesses to Bastion, and I think that he needs a ton to work with him, and most of the time it's just not worth the effort. I'm going to put Bastion in the D tier, but that doesn't mean you can't whip him out against certain players and certain teams, depending on your rank, and still get a ton of value with him. And of course, just like every character, even at the low tiers on this list, you can still grind him high up and get to Grandmaster. Next up, let's talk about Cassidy. Cassidy's an interesting one because while Cassidy is a character that does have a hard time against a lot of long distance pocket characters in the game, characters like Widow, Sojourn, Ashe, he actually is pretty good against some of the various counter pick options that are played, some of the other types of strategies that see play in the game. So like, for example, let's talk about an Echo or a Junkrat, characters like this. He's actually pretty good against, and I think generally he's going to be a pretty powerful character up to the highest ranks where people are playing a lot of these pocket enabled characters and a lot of these pockets, so you're up against really, really talented Widowmakers. I'm going to put him in the B tier, but depending on the rank you're in, I think towards GM Plus, he's going to be closer to the C tier, and for the majority of the ranks, he's going to be towards high B, but just keep that in mind when you're considering grinding Cassidy. Next up, we got to talk about Genji. And Genji is in a very weird spot because if you are technically up against certain types of characters, I think you can get pretty decent value on the Genji. Like, you can play pretty well up against Zens, of course, and Anas and things like that. And of course, Nanoblade's still a powerful combo, but Genji's base is really, really weak. He's not capable of getting a lot of solo kills, especially against characters that are being pocketed. And with Dive not seeing a lot of play right now, he is just not really shining in the way that he could. And his character is just pretty underpowered, especially with a lot of the recent changes and nerfs to the character. I think I'm going to put him in C tier here. I think Genji is still a character that if you master him, you can definitely climb, especially in the lower ranks with. But there's just a lot easier way to gain SR right now. And yeah, he's pretty brutal. But all that being said, they should definitely nerf Genji. Okay, we're going to talk about Echo. And Echo's definitely a weird one because she's very difficult to play. And I think a lot of people rate Echo low because of how difficult Echo is to play. When you truly master Echo, you can get a ton of freaking value. Now, that being said, with characters like pocketed Sojourn, pocketed Ashe, running around, even a Tracer's pretty annoying as an Echo. Echo does have a lot of competition, and I think that Echo's pretty hard to play without a pocket right now. But if you're good enough on Echo and you're really, really disciplined with the angles that you're peeking, you can get a ton of value on this character. She's basically just like a better Genji, and a better ultimate, better neutral, capable of actually dealing damage and bursting down tanks. There's a lot to love about Echo, and I'm going to put Echo in the A tier. Still very strong, and I would imagine that Echo is going to see a lot more play in the future. Next up, let's talk about Hanzo. And a weird thing has kind of happened with Hanzo. Hanzo is actually not that bad. I mean, he's not great, and he doesn't have any DPS passive anymore because all he gets is a reload buff, which doesn't help him. But the thing that's really good about Hanzo Hanzo is when you're up against characters that are trying to deal damage from range and get pocketed for it. So like Sojourn, Ashe, Widowmaker. While he's not as good directly as all these characters when they're pocketed, he's actually a decent character that can shut these characters down even if he's not being pocketed, which is pretty interesting. He actually gets a lot of value helping his teammates get picks too. Like let's say both teams have a Widowmaker, being able to threaten that Widowmaker and help your Widowmaker with walls with your sonic arrow. I think that Hanzo is actually pretty decent, a little bit slept on, and I actually gonna put him in the B tier as well with Cassidy. Pretty decent character. I think that if they gave him something to compensate for the fact that he just like doesn't have a passive anymore, I think he would become more viable. But especially in a meta like this where there's not really much dive, Hanzo is kind of flourishing a little bit in a surprising way. Next up, let's talk about Junkrat. And Junkrat is kind of becoming that sleeper anti-meta pick. Very strong at area denial, very good at punishing tanks. Characters like Orisa, characters like Ramatra and Hog. He can put a ton of pressure on all these characters and at the same time deny LOS or still be effective while not LOSing enemy long distance projectile or hit scan characters. So when you consider all those things together, I think Junkrat's in a really great position. And I'm actually going to put Junkrat all the way up towards the A tier. I mean, really high up, really strong. I think Junkrat is fantastic right now and one of the best characters to be playing if you're not really a hit scan player. And I know that Sojourn's not really hit scan, but oftentimes hit scan players play Sojourn, so yeah, it doesn't really matter. Next up, let's talk about Mei. Mei's a weird one because I think that specifically, if you're trying to enable your tank, catch the enemy tank off guard, and you have a good synergy with your tank, you can get some decent value out of Mei. But unfortunately, a lot of Mei's neutral play isn't the greatest, and you're not going to have that long distance burst. It's going to be pretty hard for you to fight against long distance DPS. So I think you're in a rough situation against characters like Ashe, characters like Widow, characters like Sojourn. But if you can help your tank win the tank 1v1, then, you know, that can be a ton of value. So I'm actually going to put her in the top of C tier, but still not a fantastic pick. Unfortunately, I think that Mei is really kind of suffering right now from just a lot of things to do with the meta. Her wall value isn't as strong as it was in 6v6. There's a lot of little factors here and there that make it so she's in the C tier. Next up, let's talk about Pharah. Pharah's an interesting character because I think Pharah is really strong, even though there's a lot of characters that can definitely shut her down. Hit scans can be really troublesome to deal with, but on certain maps like Koth, you can really easily play around natural cover. You can play around line of sight. I think that Pharah is really strong, really powerful. In some situations, if you have that pocket, you can just be absolutely dominant on Pharah, and a really skilled Pharah can definitely make it work. I'm going to put Pharah at the top of the B tier. Very strong, very powerful, capable of bullying tanks as well. There's a lot to love about this character right now. Next up, let's talk about Reaper. Reaper's a character that isn't seeing a crazy amount of play, but I think Reaper's a bit slept on. Reaper's really strong. Now, granted, he doesn't really outrange a lot of the characters in the game, and he's not really that great at contesting pocketed DPS either. Like, he's not great at contesting like a pocketed Sojourn. He's not really that great at doing any of that, but what he is good at doing is playing with his tank, attritioning out the enemy team, and setting up these really precise engagements with his team and basically going in and bursting down a target in a 1v1. He can be aggressive with his teleports. He can go and drop in on the back line. There's a lot of things that Reaper can do and enable that I think is pretty powerful, but against some compositions, of course, he's going to have a hard time. It's going to kind of depend on what your team is playing and how your team is playing around you and who you're specifically diving. But I do think he's actually a pretty good character, all things considered. I'm actually going to put him between Pharah and Cassidy. Still pretty good, but definitely not as strong as he was in like the previous metas or a couple metas ago. Still very good character, and especially when we're talking about a lot of the lower SRs, I think he's one of the best characters to climb with for sure. Now we do gotta talk about Sojourn. Yeah, I mean, it's no surprise Sojourn's in the S tier. Sojourn's freaking dominant right now. Being pocketed by a Mercy as Sojourn is just kind of the raid boss, especially when we talk about GM Plus where people are hitting consistent railgun shots. Sojourn just becomes like an absolute monster. But even outside of that, Sojourn just has really great neutral, really great damage output, really great potential pickoffs, great dueling. I mean, there's so much about this character that is just completely busted. This character definitely deserves S tier, and it's not close. Next up, we got to talk about Soldier 76. Soldier 76 is in a weird situation because he's actually not great against a lot of the other long-distance hit scans. I mean, he can get really outdistanced compared to characters like Widow and Ashe and Sojourn, but he is a character that I think is really great for ranked for a lot of reasons. He can actually play by himself in an off angle, apply a ton of pressure, and really look for these key pickoffs on the enemy supports or just just applying a ton of pressure to force them to use cooldowns, I think he's actually pretty good. And he's actually really strong in the right situation. But you do have to have pretty precise aim, and you have to make sure that you are setting up these cross timings properly with your team. You don't want to get into a situation where enemies come after you and you kind of get caught out without retreating properly. But all in all, I do think that he's a very strong character, even if there are some characters in the meta that kind of outclass him a bit. I'm going to put him towards the top of the B tier. Next up, let's talk about Tracer. And Tracer's actually really freaking strong, especially in the right hands. Tracer has infinite potential and the ability to just completely hard carry games. Definitely one of those characters that can pressure Mercy a lot, which is something that is really important with these Mercies flying around the battlefield, kind of getting away for free, getting reses off for free if you're a good Tracer, capable of camping reses, shutting down the Mercy, preventing a lot of the Mercy value. I think that that's really the route to victory on Tracer. If you can just farm Mercies all the way up, prevent them, or just prevent them from getting as much value as they normally would, you're going to get a ton of value on Tracer. And for these reasons, I'm actually putting Tracer in the S tier. I know that you're going to need a lot of skill to play Tracer like an S tier character, but if you have the skill involved, Tracer is definitely capable of being that hard carry threat, and a really great complement to, like, if you have on your team a pocketed DPS, you really want to play another DPS on your team that doesn't require pocket or doesn't even care about a pocket, so then that Mercy can really prioritize the character that does want to get pocketed. So, like, let's say in a composition you're playing both Sojourn and Ashe, the Mercy has to decide who they pocket a lot of the time, versus if you play like Sojourn Tracer, now it's obvious that they just focus on your Sojourn, and then the Tracer can kind of go up and be disruptive in the back line, and it works really well right now in the meta. Next up, we do got to talk about Torb, and Torb is a character that is actually being super slept on as well. Super strong at just dealing out pressure. He's not really good at getting initial pickoffs or anything like that, but he just applies so much pressure to the enemy tank, provides a ton of pressure to characters like Echo, characters like Tracer, and even Mercy flying around with his turret. I think that one of the biggest things about him, though, is that he can survive things like a Roadhog hook. He can survive getting headshotted even when the enemy is being pocketed. And yeah, I think he's actually a pretty great character right now. All in all, I'm gonna put him towards the bottom of A tier. Really strong and probably one of the best characters to climb with if you are not like a traditional DPS player, but you want to climb your DPS. Torb might just be like that golden ticket to climb you up really easily. Next up, let's talk about Widowmaker. Of course, Widowmaker is going to not have a high win rate in a lot of the lower ranks, right? Because she requires a really high skill floor to play well. But when we're talking about Masters and above, or GM and above, Widowmaker is just completely dominant. Very, very strong. One of the best counters to pocketed Sojourn or pocketed Ashe is a Widowmaker that is just better. A Widowmaker that could shut down the enemy team, get these pickoffs without even being pocketed. And yeah, especially when there's not a lot of dive being played besides like Tracer, you're going to get away with a lot on this character. And if the enemy just wants to kind of brawl on the front line with Orisa or just engage in like these close range hook battles, Widow can play way outside that effective range and get value. So when we talk about meta from the top down, Widowmaker is S tier. Now, is she going to be S tier in your rank? Maybe, maybe not. We'll have to wait and see. It's going to depend on the people's skill in that lobby. But Widow is definitely going to be one of the highest characters or the strongest characters right now in the top-down meta or the overarching meta. Next up, we got to talk about Sim. And I think that Sim is actually pretty strong on certain maps. There's a lot of Koth maps that you can get a lot of value with Sim. There's a lot of places in which you can teleport, a lot of specific maps that you can teleport, get a lot of value. Not the greatest character to play against like characters like Hog. And there's a lot of characters that can really punish the Sim. I think Echo's great against Sim. Like Pharah is great against Sim. And just various one-tap characters are pretty good against Sim. But Sim can definitely get a lot of value in the right hands. But all that considered, I'm going to put Sim at the bottom of B. I think that Sim is amazing in the right hands, but pretty mediocre in the wrong hands. So it's going to be kind of a wash for the character. You have to have a lot of specialty knowledge, I would say, to get Sim to work. It's not a character that even decent Sim players or decent players in general will be able to make work. But if you have a crazy high skill level on the character, then you can definitely make her work in this meta. Next up, we got to talk about Sombra. And Sombra is a weird situation because I think that Sombra, unfortunately, is just really underpowered right now. She is decent in theory, right? With hacks and being able to gather information and all that stuff. But just due to the nature of ranked, you're never going to set up like some type of coordination. The hacks don't last long enough to you actually punishing a tank. And EMP is just super underpowered right now. I think that she's actually one of the weakest characters in the game right now. I'm going to put her all the way down in D tier with Bastion. Doesn't mean that you can't get value out of Sombra, but it's really the only time you're going to whip her out is when you're trying to counter something very specific. So like if you want to just counter a Widowmaker or counter a Wrecking Ball, you could swap to Sombra and basically just like be a perma counter threat. But outside those situations, you would much rather be playing a million other things. Tracer, Reaper, freaking Echo. I mean, there's a million different things in the similar category that you would rather play. So I'm putting her all the way down here, and I think that this is a pretty balanced tier list for where I would place things at right now in the current meta. Definitely a meta where I think specifically like Sojourn pocketed DPS or just pocketed DPS in general are just one of the best things that you could be doing. And there are a couple of counter pocket strategies, I think, or counter long distance strategies like a really good Tracer or a Junkrat. But for the most part, it's going to be a lot of long distance fights, and yeah, hopefully we see some mix-ups soon, but for now this is going to be the existing meta, and definitely press that subscribe and stay tuned because we're going to be doing the support and tank tier list combined next. So yeah, definitely let me know if you have any questions, if you agree or disagree, and please smash that like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon for private coaching. I'll see you next time.